Hey friends, you're listening to Changing the Conversation, a podcast by African Leadership in the Mocha Club, where we take time to sit down and explore topics to challenge our perspective in pursuit of better loving people in the world around us. I am so excited to be bringing you our podcast today. I am sitting down with two dear friends of our organization, Pastor Mezack, who is our country director in Rwanda, and Duane Murray, who is a dear friend of the organization, has been a supporter, a traveler with us. They have become really good, close friends. And so I had the distinct pleasure of just sitting down on their conversation and listening to their stories. Pastor Mezack is actually in Nashville for a little visit and spending time with us. And so I just want you to hear his story. He has a really amazing story about his work in Rwanda and how training and teaching pastors and leaders in Africa has actually had an impact here in the States as well. So welcome.
Thank you, Fallon.
You're welcome. Welcome, Pastor Mezack.
Thank you so much.
We're so excited you're here. So yeah, I would just love to dive right in and just kind of share your guys' stories and your friendship, and then would love to hear more of Pastor Mezack's impact on people in Africa and in the States.
Fallon, I'm really excited to get to do this because I get to be on a podcast.
I know,
and
right?
I get to brag to my college students, my children, that, hey, I'm on a podcast. And they're like, oh, Dad, aren't you cooler than us? So
right.
Anyway, but my favorite part is I get to be on a podcast with one of my favorite people in the world, a man I look up to, Mezack. And because I don't overstate this, that he's one of the most effective disciple makers I've met in the world. And I've been a few places, 10 countries and 21 different trips in the last 10 years.
Wow.
So not by choice, but by obedience.
Yes.
I didn't go, hey, I want to go to these places. In fact, most of the time I was going, God, I'm really good. I can stay right where I'm at and minister where I'm at.
Right.
God would say, no, you got to go. I get to be a part of this conversation. My brief history, 12 years in healthcare, felt like that was where God called me to be. Then God called me out of that into soul care. I got to be an executive pastor and missions pastor for 13 years. And recently, God called me back into the marketplace. I get to serve and support CEOs and business owners who are Christian, who are trying to live out their faith in their workplace. And I do that with C12 Group. So that's my brief background.
Awesome.
I had the privilege of meeting Mezack, I think 4 or 5 years ago, on one of my first trips to Africa, and we came through Rwanda, but God just kept drawing us back, and in his humble way, he never begged or pleaded for us to come back. He just really kind of waited for God's timing. So, Mezack, welcome. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you and I first met and what God's been doing in your life recently.
Thank you so much, Pastor Duane. Myself, I'm Pastor Mezack. I serve God in Rwanda and Burundi as African Leadership Country Director. Since 2001, I started training pastors and lay leaders in different churches. By now, we have already trained about 5,000 in both countries, and we are seeing much impact into the life of many people being transformed through those whom we have trained. After they graduate from our training, many of them have started new churches, and they are changing many people's life through their ministry, spiritually and even socially.
They're having a great impact. We've got so many stories that I want to kind of follow the trail of thought on. We met about 4 or 5 years ago as you were hosting us as we traveled through, but one of the things we got to do was go visit some of the pastors that had come through the training and are now out and working. Why don't you tell us about one of those students? You mentioned a couple last night, Pastor Tom, and well, let's talk about Pastor Tom because that's going to connect us back to our core topic today.
As Pastor Duane and his team visited us, we normally used to visit where Pastor Tom is ministering. Pastor Tom is one of our graduates. He is in the Eastern Province, whereby he's leading 3 new churches. But unfortunately, 2 of them nowadays are closed because they are not meeting the criteria of the government towards having nice buildings built. We are encouraged to build those churches so that they may continue worshiping. And Pastor Tom is ministering to those people spiritually, but also to help them raise some pigs to the community so that they may be able to send their children to school and to buy some medical insurance for their families.
So the pigs are used, sorry, interjecting to make sure I understand. They buy the pigs and then essentially sell them for income for their children.
Correct. And use them for food and those kind of things. So
awesome.
Yeah. So I was introduced to African leadership about 8 years ago. And what attracted me most to African leadership was the idea that this was an organization that was focused on discipleship.
Right.
And what I began to realize, and as is implied by the name, it wasn't just discipleship from a spiritual standpoint, but it was also leadership discipleship. Mm-hmm. Of course, when somebody mentions discipleship, my thought immediately becomes, is there replication? Is it reproducing or multiplying? If not, for me, it doesn't feel like it's really discipleship. If there's not reproduction happening and you see multiplication. And when I visited the first time and we sat in a room with probably 20 to 30 pastors that had been under the training of Mezack, what I began to see immediately was multiplication. Not it was evident. You didn't have to look for it. It was abundant. And that just made me kind of get on the edge of my seat and pull in a little closer and ask, how real is this multiplication? And so I want to unpack what you just talked about with Pastor Tom, because the multiplication and the location in eastern Rwanda that he's ministering started a long time ago. And I know the background story to this because I've driven many hours on the roads in Rwanda with Mezack and asked many questions. So I'm excited to tell this story because it's really neat. So reminding us all, right, Rwanda has gone through a terrible genocide that happened, so many years ago, and I think 23 years ago.
Yeah,
right?
24 now.
24. And right after that genocide happened, you actually began working with some organizations that were helping children who were displaced by the genocide that were not with their families to hopefully get reconnected with their families. Tell a little bit about that experience and the work you ended up connecting to in Matunguru with one of your other students.
After genocide, I was working with an organization from Denmark that was taking care of displaced children. We were bringing together children from who were out from their families. Separated from their families. We were doing reunification. Mm-hmm. And one of the kids was from the area, Karambi area. We brought her from the orphanage where she was, and we took her to her home to reunite her with her family. And when we got there in Karambi area, people in the area, because we introduced ourselves as pastors too, though we were working with the orphanage, but still we were serving God as pastors. So they told us about the need they had of a church. So we agreed to start a church in that area. Within a few years, Lamech was one of our trainees. When he graduated, we sent him there. And he kept leading that church. He was the one who made that church grow.
Wow.
Because the time we started, it was very small. But when Lamech got there, that church grew up till he went to the refugee camp in Uganda. So after he went, we sent Thomas. Thomas also was a graduate. They were a classmate with Lamech. So Thomas went there. After Lamech has gone, during the time of Thomas, they started other 2 new churches, which are existing now.
That's just so beautiful. I mean, I look at that and I go, okay, so Lamech was a trained student who started a church, and now he's handed that church off to Thomas. And Lamech also was involved. He said he went to a refugee camp, but in the refugee camp, Lamech got involved with another pastor who they started a church in the refugee camp that grew to 4,000.
Wow.
4,000, and is still going today in Uganda in that refugee camp. And, you just go, is there real discipleship happening here? And the answer is absolutely there's real discipleship happening here. One of the churches that, and I got the name wrong earlier, so he corrected me, Korombe was where we went. That's where they started the church. And then 2 churches have been started from that. And one was in Matunguru, right?
Yes.
And so when you talked about the pigs earlier, on our last trip here this February, we got to go, and Matunguru, we stopped by and we see this really small house, and they're like, yeah, this is where the other church of these 2 churches has started. Wow. And so you've got this really small building that's where 90 people are meeting, and there's a beautiful part of the story that I want us to hear.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to try to lead us into that conversation. How long was Lamech in Uganda in the refugee camp, do you think?
I think Lamech spent about 7 years in the camp in Uganda.
There's actually a refugee camp that you took us to in February that's Congolese refugees that are actually in Rwanda now. And so we visited that camp. Tell us kind of the reality of what it means for somebody to live in a refugee camp for an extended period of time. I think we hear that and we think long-term camping, like an adventure, like something fun. But tell us about the hardships of a refugee camp.
There are about 4 refugee camps in Rwanda that accommodate many Congolese. In one of the camps in the eastern province, there we have this Bible school training going on year after year, because we have found good also to help them, because in the refugee camp there are so many bad things going on. Number one, because all the youth and women and men are jobless. No one works. So many of them spend many hours drinking. They are poor. Even some other bad things happen. They are just reluctant.
Yeah.
For many years. So we found good to bring Bible training there to train their pastors so that they may be able to help those around them. There we have almost, I can say, many years ago we had many who went through the training, and some of them are training others. So we have 2 classes going on in that camp. Nowadays we have about 34 candidates going on this year.
Fallon, it was incredible to see 25, 30 students, men and women, who were in this training class. And what was the name of that community that we visited?
Mugera.
And the enthusiasm, okay? Imagine the hopelessness of where they're living day in and day out, no jobs. The enthusiasm that they had just holding a Bible.
Wow.
And we actually have video testimony of them saying, you've given me the greatest riches I could ever have. For people that have to want for daily food and want for daily clothing and all those kind of things, and so that the hopelessness of the situation in which they're living. So Lamech is in Uganda, in another refugee camp, not knowing if he's going to get transferred out of his situation to another place, and meeting up with another pastor, Joseph, who has an amazing story. But here's the God cool thing that happens. I'm living in Nashville, Tennessee, living out my life, trying to live a faithful life, and God sends me to Rwanda to meet Mezack, to find out about Lamech, who gets immigrates to, America, but where? Nashville, Tennessee. He's in Antioch,
Wow.
like a surrounding community. And Lamech
Wow.
and Joseph and their families all get transferred or sent here in order to be here and begin to live lives outside of a refugee camp and to get jobs and to do those kind of things. And guess what this disciple of Christ does when he moves here? He starts a church.
Okay, so you don't really hear that. You hear a lot of Americans here in the States that have this desire to go beyond their own community and impact the world. So they travel and do missions in Africa, in China, wherever it might be. But you don't really hear stories of Africans feeling that same call to be on mission coming to the States. But that's exactly what is happening.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good thing for us to follow with Mezack on, because I'm sure that they didn't have it in their hearts to move to America.
Sure.
Or maybe they did. Do you think Lamech and Joseph wanted to be here, or would they have preferred to be in Africa still if they had a choice?
I think God does things beyond our understanding for us to accomplish His own purpose. According to my imagination, Lamech and Joseph and other African pastors who have come here, I think before they could not imagine or even think, even dream to be in America in such a time, whether they were thinking to live in Africa for good. But within a short time, God changes the situation. The bad things happen.
Mm-hmm.
They left their homes, their properties were taken, some of the people were killed, and they ran to save their lives.
Yeah.
Without knowing where they are going. And within another period of time, they found themselves in America, in another culture, in another ways of living, but still, they are still committed to the calling that they received from their original place.
Wow.
So I think God has a purpose for them to fulfill, even in America, to help those other African refugees who come here, which they never knew before that they will be fulfilling.
So Lamech's church is in Antioch, but Nashville. And he's been here how long?
I think 3 years?
2 years and
2
a
years.
half, maybe.
Yeah. When I think about their circumstance, so they ministered in a refugee camp and amidst hopelessness, and they delivered hope, right? The story of Christ
absolutely.
and how even in the darkest of that situation, he can deliver hope. They move with a group of people to Nashville where you're trying to integrate into a new culture. You're trying to earn a living to be able to support your family in order to do that. And the message transfers, right? There's a message of hope that gets to transfer there. And this was neat. So I met with Joseph and several church leaders from his church, and I asked them, I'm going to Rwanda. What would you ask me to share? What would you want them to know? You're sending a message through me back to your brothers and sisters in Christ in Rwanda. What would you want them to know? And I had one of the dear brothers look at me and he said, I want them to know there's hope. I want them to know there's hope. And they live here with this tension of, I'm glad to be here. My circumstances are in some ways better, in some ways just as hard. But my burden is for my brothers and sisters in Christ who are still in difficult circumstances. All around Rwanda, they're still fighting. All around, there's still tribal fighting. There's still military fighting that's going on. There's still people being run out of their homes. The refugee camps are still up and running because there's still difficulty and strife there. And so the burden is, I'm not in that circumstance anymore, but I want the people who are to know there's hope. I had this thought, Mezack, and I wonder if you can speak to this. As believers here in the U.S., many of us are burdened for saying, God, you have a heart for the world. I want to have a heart for the world. I mean, we think about it and we say, God, I want to have a heart for the world. I'm going to raise money. I'm going to go on a trip and go somewhere else in the world in order to be your instrument. Is that in the realm of possibility? Do believers in Rwanda think that way? And I'm sure none of them imagine that their circumstances are going to land them somewhere else. But
yeah, I believe believers in Rwanda or some other places in Africa, they understand that they are part of the body of Christ in the world. So they have that such a burden, though they have no possibility to reach the world, but through prayer and through they being to living as a light in the world, they think about the world, to reach the world in some way or another. Yeah.
So you're an example of this. Mezack grew up Rwandan, but in the Congo, and then trained in Nairobi, right, for Bible school, and then was back teaching, and probably never imagined that your life would have an international impact. But just review for the listeners, where are your students? You have students in America, all over America, and where are your children?
Yeah. At the beginning, I never knew that my ministry will be extended to the extent where it is now. For instance, let me start with my family. When I lead my children to know the Lord, to teach them about God, I never knew that they will go. One is now in Australia. She's serving God there. My son is going to be here in Iowa within next month. His wife is already here. And other two children are in Nairobi. One is in Rwanda. So I never knew that my family will spread all over the world. And where they are serving God. My son is a singer. He plays piano and the guitar. My daughters are singers. One is a deacon in a church in Nairobi. Also, about those whom I minister to in the church and those whom I train in Bible school, I never knew they will be all over the world. For instance, now I have some disciples in Europe. One is in Denmark. Some are here in USA. One is in Ohio, yes. Another one is here in Nashville. Recently, I met another one who is in Iowa. He has just come with last month. Let me see where somebody is. Yes, I forget maybe some others.
There's lots out there.
Well, and discovering all the time as God takes them. I want to talk about that. Related to this is just understanding how God will use difficult circumstances and specifically a refugee camp experience as his launching pad to get somebody where they need to go. So somebody in Africa growing up with minimal income and minimal ability, the thought of, I'm going to raise money and fly to another country and do missions there, or even replant my life someplace else, just seems a lifetime of impossibility. And yet God uses what the enemy means for evil, a war, displacement through, hardship and those kind of things, to actually put somebody in a place where they can actually end up on ministry, on mission for God in another part of the world. Mezack, how would you share with our listeners about God using difficult circumstances to move us into places of ministry?
I believe God uses even some difficult circumstances still to fulfill his purposes. For instance, in Africa, we have gone through many difficulties, but through those difficulties, it makes us draw near to God. Whether through war, people seek for God. They draw near to God. When they are refugees, they know the only hope is in God, because whether they are facing famine, sicknesses, and other difficult life, still that makes them humble themselves to seek God's face. That also is God's tool to draw many people to himself, though we don't understand what is going on. And that makes also them to pray for good leadership for their countries.
So I just want to jump in because this conversation reminds me of many conversations I've had with Tito, our country director in South Sudan, who currently works in Uganda, actually at the refugee camps there. And he always says for him, these refugee camps that looking at them may seem desolate and hopeless, for him, it's a place of opportunity because now all these refugees have the gift of time where they have time to sit and read the word and be discipled and to hear teachings where before they were trying to work really hard to support their families or travel or whatever it is. And so, for him, it's switching that mindset of it can feel like a desolate place, which it is in certain perspectives, but that really is a gift of opportunity to have these people learn and grow in their faith.
He has such a great perspective, and it's so real for him. It reminds me, as Mezack was talking about it as well, so many people want to reject God on the basis that if he's a good God, why does he allow bad things to happen? And kind of the statement is, these bad people in really hard situations, certainly their heart is hard towards God. But what I consistently see, and Mezack is giving testimony to, is people in the hardest of situations are actually drawn closer to God. Their hardship doesn't reject God, right? Their hardness of the situation actually draws them closer to God, and they realize the reality of how near he is, and he's with us in the middle of those circumstances. And I think that's great.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to underscore in the conversation you're hearing from Mezack, with the genocide happening and with the world really not responding during the genocide, and now coming back around, governments and countries coming back around and saying, we really messed up, let's help now. There's a lot of countries now pouring all kinds of resources into Rwanda, and they're pouring economic development in, they're pouring educational development, a lot of good things, healthcare, and increasing and improving standards all across the country. And one of the things you mentioned earlier, Mezack, was how churches are being shut down because they're not meeting building code standards. So it's simple as not having restrooms, not having sound absorption in the building to keep it from being too noisy for neighbors. And over 6,000 churches across Rwanda have been closed. And having been in Kigali, where there's so much development, and honestly, it starts to look like a first world city, and it's so clean and so many good things are happening. And while those things are developing, the spiritual light is being snuffed out. Pastor, talk just a brief moment about your burden for seeing the church continue to grow and thrive amidst all these churches being shut down.
Yes, this shutting down of the churches, it really encourages ministers to meet the standard of the development of the city. Kigali is developing. The government wants churches to meet that standard of the building, though it is very difficult for many churches to meet that standard because church members are poor. They don't have money to build such nice buildings and to do all such kind of things. So in one way, according to the development, is good to live in an area which is developed. But in another way, many churches won't meet that standard. So few churches will meet that standard with a lot of difficulties. And that has pushed many churches to work very hard so that they may continue functioning. Other churches, according to my point of view and as I see, they will never meet it.
Wow.
So they will close for good.
That's an opportunity for us just to pray with them and to engage with them and that endeavor. I know we're working, our church, Thompson Station Church, is working with African leadership and working with Mezack's church there in Kigali to actually help them complete a building. The current church building they're in is sufficient, it's fine, meeting their needs, but the government has said, no, that area of town, we want to have this kind of development in that area of town, so that can no longer be a church building. It's going to be this instead. You got to find new space, which they found, but it's that whole process of, but now building a building there requires these new standards. And the beautiful thing is God's answering that prayer.
Awesome.
So as hard as it is for them to earn a living, their church alone has already raised $63,000 towards building the new facility that meets the standard. Different people connected with our church and with African leadership have now raised another $60,000. We've got another $60,000 to go to get it done. But it's I'm excited that in sustaining this particular church, we're also sustaining a office and an opportunity for African leadership to continue to train pastors, which is another standard the government has said is you can't have pastor a church and without having Bible training or a seminary degree.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so it's a great opportunity for, again, back to yours, this hardship on the church and this standard across the country is actually creating opportunity for African leadership.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
so we're excited to get to continue to pray with you, Mezack, and with your body and with African Leadership Rwanda to see God expand his work there.
Definitely, we are so grateful for African Leadership and the Thompson Station Church to help us meet that standard. By our own, we were so desperate when the situation occurred in the country. We were among those who were supposed to shut the door for good because we had no means to build such a nice building and to meet the standard of the city. But through African Leadership and Tom Station Church, now our hope has increased, and we are looking forward even to assist our small churches into the villages. I'm really grateful, so grateful for what you are doing. Through your support, financially, through your prayers, we all can accomplish big things for the sake of the kingdom. And we look forward for short-time missionaries to be coming and help us do the work of God in Africa. God bless you.
Mezack, we are so thankful for you and all that you do on behalf of African leadership and your community in Rwanda and to the ends of the earth now in Canada, United States, just everywhere. So thank you so much for all you do. This was a great conversation. Thank you guys so much for being here. And thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation and just learned a little bit more about our work across the continent of Africa, but also how that impacts the rest of the world and even back here in the United States. It's pretty incredible. So leave comments. We would love to hear from you what you thought of the show, what really struck you. If you have any other questions about what you heard, we are very available to continue the conversation. So please reach out to us. Follow both African Leadership and the Mocha Club on socials. African Leadership is at African Leadership, both on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And Mocha Club is at Mocha Club on all three social media platforms as well. So thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you soon.